this video, we will be talking about food guidelines. We'll first go through a history as to what food laws looked like here in the United States. Then we'll talk about our current food guidelines, how those are created, and how, yes, there are some politics involved when it comes to creating these food guidelines. All right, so let's start with the history. Early on in our country's history, food laws and drug laws were performed more so at the state and local levels. This was because there wasn't really much or very little interstate travel happening during this time. So because of that, products stayed more local and they didn't travel from state to state necessarily. So it was easy to just keep that regulation within each state. However, as urbanization advanced and as technology advanced, there was more of a need to create stringent guidelines. Before we get into that though, I did want to note that with local and state level regulations, there were some good successes that came out of those. For instance, in 1641, there were regulations placed in Virginia that placed better guidelines as far as inspections for meat products. However, in 1906, it became apparent that it would be more appropriate to have regulations at the federal level. Now, there were some things that were happening within the food and the drug industry. Adulteration is when things are added to a product, which this might be to cheapen the quality. So by cheapening the quality of a product, that means they could sell it for a lower price and they can get more business that way. Also, they can mask impurities. So by using certain products within the food or the drug, they could cover up, let's say there's something stale in the product, they can mask the staleness in the product so that it looked desirable, but probably wasn't something you should be eating. So in 1906, the first federal law, the Pure Food and Drug Act, and also the Meat Inspection Act came into being. Another reason for the development of these acts was in part due to a social movement after the release of The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. It's a book and it's actually available on Google. You can, since it's an older book, the copyright laws have been lifted, so you can actually read the PDF version of The Jungle on your phone or computer. Anyway, so this book exposed the meat industry and fraud within the meat industry, which caused an outrage and was part of the reason why these 1906 laws came into being. Now, the 1906 laws, there were some successes that came with these regulations. For instance, there was better regulation in the seafood industry, and there was also more honesty when it came to the weight of products. But there were some things that were still happening, particularly in the pharmaceutical companies, that remained fraudulent, that remained dishonest, and that dishonesty could and did end up harming people. For instance, there was this elixir drug that people were taking and people were dying from it. And so there was public outrage due to the large amount of deaths that came from taking this medication. And so partially as a response to this and from other pressures as well, they developed a more comprehensive act called the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. So one other just difference is they added cosmetics now to this new act because there were some fraudulent practices happening in the cosmetic industry as well. So one big takeaway from the Food, Drugs, and Cosmetics Act that is still used today is that standards of identity were developed so that we can have better standardization to say, let's say, for instance, differentiating between what's a jam and what's a jelly, or what's a good quality meat and what's not a good quality meat. So those are a few examples of practices or identities that were created through this particular law. Now we've had a few somewhat more recent laws that have been developed. In 1990, there was the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act, which standardized nutrition labeling and nutrition information. So again, standards were created so that food labels and food reporting were consistent between company to company. There weren't irregularities between one food label to another. Then in 1994, we had another legislation, the Dietary Supplements and Nutritional Labeling Act. This one, a big takeaway from this is that the FDA lost its ability to regulate supplements. So with the supplement industry, they can make claims that aren't necessarily scientifically accurate. So that was kind of unfortunate when it came to the nutrition industry, in that we can't necessarily regulate our dietary supplements. Okay, so now let's talk about the US Dietary Guidelines. These are released every 5 years by Health and Human Services and the US Department for Agriculture. Right now we have the 2015 to 2020 guidelines. So sometime within the next year or so, we'll see new guidelines for the next 5 years and what they're recommending as far as dietary trends. Now, these guidelines are informed by an expert panel of nutrition experts, but they don't necessarily dictate what goes into the guidelines. That's done by Health and Human Services and the USDA. Now, something interesting to know is that the USDA is in charge of all agriculture. Part of that agriculture means the meat industry. So there's very strong lobbying that goes on, particularly we see from the meat industry, as to what exactly those guidelines say. We'll take a look in a minute to see how those recommendations from the expert panel and how the dietary guidelines don't necessarily reflect one another. So in the expert panel, in their recommendations, they talked about red meat and how red meat should be limited, and processed meat as well. And also diets should be low in sugar sweetened beverages. Again, we'll take a look at that in a second. They also talked about the idea of sustainability. Sustainability is something that we'll talk about more towards the end of our class, but essentially saying that some food products, particularly meat, aren't necessarily sustainable when it comes to our environment and when it comes to money as well. Now, with the US Dietary Guidelines, you'll see on their website, it's interesting that it's not necessarily meant for the average consumer. So for you and me to go onto the US Dietary Guidelines and use that for information for ourselves. They say it's more so to inform the medical community, nutritionists, policies, etc., when it comes to making diet recommendations. Another thing that these guidelines influence is government programs. So things such as the school lunch program, WIC, which is Women, Infant, and Children. They have a supplemental nutrition program that gives food allotments to their people who are participating in it. SNAP, that's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. They also rely on these US dietary guidelines as well when it comes to the type of aid and the type of food that they're going to give. So for instance, school lunch programs, because as we'll see, the guidelines don't say anything about limiting red meat specifically, they can still give red meat in however many quantities to children. There's also with sugar sweetened beverages, which we can include juice as well. They do say 100% juice is recommended, but those juices have added sugar as well. All right, so let's take a look at let's go to this one first. All right, so I already did a search term here for red and processed meat. This is from the committee that helps to inform the dietary guidelines. And here we see the overall body of evidence examined, says a healthy diet pattern is fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, seafood. That's all great. Then it says lower in red and processed meat and low in sugar sweetened foods and beverages and refined grains. We then go further down and we see that, let's see, where was that term? Here we go. For conclusions with moderate to strong evidence, higher intake of red and processed meat was identified as detrimental. They use the word detrimental compared to lower intake, higher consumption, as detrimental compared to lower intake. They also say higher consumption of sugar-sweetened foods and beverages, as well as refined grains, was identified as detrimental. Again, we're detrimental. However, if we look at the actual, so now we're on the dietary guidelines, doesn't seem as grim of a prognosis for red meat. So it talks about meat. In this case, they're saying meat is red meat. Also talking about poultry as well. And that the recommendation for the meat, poultry, and egg subgroup, let's see. Here we go. So essentially they're saying that there's a recommendation for variety of protein coming from meat, poultry, and eggs, including a variety of lean meats, lean poultry, etc. It then says that we should limit sodium, calories from saturated fats, and added sugars and total calories. It does mention the fact that there is evidence that lower intakes of meat help to reduce cardiovascular disease, but essentially what I'm trying to get at is when it comes to groups like the ADA, American Diabetics Association, the Heart Association, when they saw these guidelines, they didn't think they were strong enough. They didn't think that they were necessarily appropriate when it comes to the current state of the health of Americans and how a lot of the conditions that people are living with and dying from in the United States are strongly tied to our diets and what we're eating. Now, one thing that did make it into the guidelines that was applauded was the fact that added sugars this time were addressed. Normally added sugars in the past historically have not been addressed within the dietary guidelines. We can thank companies such as the soft beverage companies for us not seeing added sugars. However, we finally got to see added sugars in the dietary guidelines and recommendations based on that. So let's go back to our slides here. So what does this mean for us? Well, it's helpful to take nutrition classes because we are better able to learn what constitutes as a healthier diet and what doesn't necessarily constitute as a healthier diet. Me giving this video, this isn't me saying that we absolutely can never have sugar sweetened beverages, we absolutely can never have red meat. However, we need to understand that if we have these foods on a consistent basis, over time, that additive effect is probably going to be negative for our health. So all of this to say that these guidelines, they're guidelines. They're helpful, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily absolute truth. So that's why we, as consumers, need to be smart consumers, and we need to use discretion in what we buy and what we eat.